You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. Recep Tayyip Erdogan has secured a historic win in Turkey's first presidential elections, cementing his role as the nation's leader for the next 5 years. With almost all the votes counted, Mr. Erdogan led with 52%. This was 13 points ahead of his main opponent, Ekmelettin Ihsanoglu, a Turkish diplomat with a low domestic profile. The election marks the first stage of an ambitious plan by Mr. Erdogan to transform Turkey's government into one led by presidential politics, with himself as leader. He wants to secure more power for the presidency, but his opponents do fear increasingly authoritarian rule. Until now, the presidency has been largely ceremonial, but this is set to change. So what do these elections signify for the future of Turkey? Well, to discuss this and the issues surrounding it, I'm pleased to be joined in the studio by Dr. Ezra Ozuriak, who's the Chair for Contemporary Turkish Studies at the London School of Economics. Also here in the studio, Michael Serçan Daventry, who's the English editor at the Londra Gazeta. That's the voice of London's Turkish, Kurdish and Turkish Cypriot communities. Also here is Dr. Konstantinos Matakos, who's a fellow in political science and political economy at the LSE. And on the line, Benjamin Essen, who's a social security inspector at the Social Security Institution of Turkey. He's also a columnist at Turkey's daily Sabah newspaper. Benjamin, I'll start with you. First of all, I mean, each time Turkish citizens have gone to the ballot box since 2002, the AKP has been victorious. So I guess Mr. Erdogan must be doing something right.
Yeah, that's right. A good point. This is the 9th election victory of President-elect of Recep Tayyip Erdogan, and this is very important, I think, because in the recent history of the Europe, we couldn't see any political leader who can reach this succession race. I think the main point is that Erdogan's policies has the power to touch the daily lives of people on the ground, especially the welfare policies. The voters, the ordinary voters' voting preferences are pretty sensitive to welfare policies, and Erdogan is very, very ambitious and has made several reforms in that area. Especially middle and low-income voting groups are voting in favor of Erdogan because they are feeling the improvements in their daily lives. I want to refer somebody, Adil Gür, ANG polling company from Turkey, and also Bekir Ağırdır, Konda polling company. They are saying that especially housewives and low-income groups are going to the ballot and voting for Erdogan because they are pretty sensitive for the services, the improvements in the services. In this sense, Adil Gür emphasized that housewives are the best on acting accordingly to the realpolitik. They can feel the improvements in healthcare services, for example, family practitioners, and decrease in medicine prices. The main achievement of Erdogan is his social policy.
And I guess one of the other achievements, Ezra, is that the considerable eye-watering growth, economic growth in Turkey, something like 9% back in 2010, while the rest of Europe were hammered by an economic crisis. Are people voting with their pockets?
Many observers share this point that the good economy has been a major concern for the voters. For example, studies show that most of the voters, for example, didn't care that much about the bribery accusations that broke in the 17th of December. That wasn't a major concern, but a good economy was a concern. So I think that really played a role.
And those bribery allegations, Michael, that she's referring to there, that was a probe launched in December. It threw up allegations of graft, kickbacks, money laundering. Mr. Erdogan, of course, denied any kind of wrongdoing, but it seemed to make more of an international splash than it did a domestic one. Would that be fair to say, do you think?
I think, yeah, that is fair to say. There seems to have been a moment round about, let's say, 2010, 2011, or shortly after he won the election in 2011, when certainly the international media stopped looking at Erdogan as the sort of darling of Muslim democracy, a sort of model that can be pushed out to other countries in the region, and started looking at him more as a bit more of an autocrat, a bit more of a man who likes to impose his will and not listen to the other side. And I think the incident that you refer to is definitely the latest in the line of that. It didn't have the impact in the country that it had outside of it.
Konstantinos, it's not the only controversy he's faced over the last few months. I mean, the mine workers, 301 perished in a tragic mine explosion in Soma. widely blamed on lax safety rules. And that would finish a lot of Western European leaders, but seemingly not him, especially after, if you look at the aftermath of him allegedly attacking a protester.
Well, that would be true in most Western societies, but there is the following thing that the previous speakers have touched upon, that Erdogan has done a lot in meeting the demands of ordinary people. And it was surprising for me to see that in the video that one of the mourners was telling the Erdogan when he was trying to be aggressive towards them, hit me, Mr. Prime Minister, but I'm in pain, so I have to complain about you, but we still love you. So there was a major imbalance in the Turkish political system that was brought by frequent military interventions and all those people who felt excluded. And coming from Greece, where the part of the excluded were the left after the Second World War, I can see how the Turkish conservative religious people would felt excluded from the centers of political decision-making and from key parts of the state. And despite being valiant, or let's say deserving to be there, they were always being pushed out. And this generated a tremendous imbalance in the political system. So when Westerners have this, allow me to say, Occidentalist approach, expecting Turkey to transform in 5 years or with one corruption scandal, when these imbalances have been going on for decades and decades, on and on, people have memory, and they, in a sense, they can see the lesser between two evils. Mr. Esen correctly said about meeting the demands of ordinary people. Well, Erdogan delivers economic growth, maybe not as tripling the GDP as he claims, maybe a moderate, only 50% increase, moderate compared to, let's say, what Russia has done or Brazil has done. And maybe this have come with corruption and with relaxing of labor safety standards. But for those people, it's not about getting a little bit of extra money, it's also about the feeling of social exclusion that Erdogan helped them overcome. Yes, it is meeting the demands of ordinary people. Yes, it's also creating some sort of clientelism and cronies that allow him to consolidate better. And it's also the grievances that those populations felt for years and years and years, which allow him to give him some slack when there is this type of policy failure. So,
Benjamin, was it a fair campaign? I mean, Mr. Erdogan was accused of using resources that weren't available to his fellow candidates.
There are some complaints in this regard from the opposition candidates and leaders. And they are saying that the campaign was unfair because they couldn't be able to propagandate on TV and other mediums. I hardly see any strong evidence for that, because so far 14 parties joined under the roof candidate and Ekmelettin İhsanoğlu, and 20 national TV stations, some are most influential ones in the country, were openly supported Demirtaş and İhsanoğlu, like CNN Turk. And 16 newspapers, including Gülen Movement's Gazette, which is the most printed newspaper in the country, Zaman, are supported strongly the opposition leaders. So I think the discussion about the campaign unfair is not depending on serious evidence.
But I have a question, though. I understand that there is oppositional press, which is normal to expect in a country that aspires to be a model of democracy in the region. But what about linking services provided by municipalities or using the state apparatus in order to promote his candidacy, right? So it's well published iftar dinners or activities of municipalities that his party controls. I mean, we all understand that when you're in power, it's partly okay in all democracies to have an advantage, right? You're playing a game in your home, if I'm allowed to use football terms. But I think Mr. Erdogan went a little bit above just playing a home game. He just maybe even intimidated, let me say, the referees a little bit.
I partially agree with Mr. Matakos, but in my opinion, the main reason for the success of Erdogan and the failure of the opposition is not these. These are the accusations of the opposition leaders for covering their failure. The reality is Erdogan followed a high-profile campaign. He organized 37 meetings in the country, and in the biggest one, in a single meeting, 2.5 million people have attended in his meeting. But the opposition leader, let's say it's Demirtaş or İhsanoğlu, he didn't even intended to make any political meeting. And if you are making a high-profile campaign, it is very natural that you will get much more reputation in the media because it acquires more news value. I think this is the main reason. Erdogan is a good politician, he's an impressive campaigner, and he's a strong organizer.
Okay, can I get Ezra's response actually just more broadly about the campaign? Okay, so Benjamin's point there is that he had, even if he does have the lion's share of mainstream television coverage, he does have genuine popularity, but also there is a new way of fighting elections. It's called social media, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, all that kind of stuff, and that has been clamped down upon, hasn't it, in Turkey?
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, of course, this was not an election where there were major allegations of corruption or anything for international standards. This was definitely fair elections, but if we look closely, the resources available to the candidates were not equal. There was not a single debate where three candidates came together and had a chance to discuss, which I think is a huge loss for a democracy. So no one had a chance to challenge Mr. Erdogan for what he has been doing in the last 11 years. And also there were some statistics, TRT, the Turkish radio and television. Erdogan was online for hundreds and hundreds of hours. And then maybe the second person was 45 minutes. And then Demirtas was 45 seconds or something. So we really cannot talk about resources and Turkey equal distribution of resources. And Turkey really does not have a good record of press freedom in the last years. We know that Turkey has really high number of journalists in jail. You know, journalists are not exactly free to write everything they want. And we know that a lot of newspapers are controlled by the government.
I think it's important just to set a bit of context to these election results, because first of all, what Erdogan did yesterday was absolutely incredible. He has secured 20 million votes, 52% of the vote. It's without a doubt the largest personal mandate that any Turkish politician has had in history. That said, the fact remains that he campaigned as Prime Minister. He did it because a large number of voters from the Nationalist Party went over to him rather than to the party that the candidate that his party supported. And also there was a large amount of voter apathy. The turnout was down to 70%.
70%?
70%. 70 to 75 is
British election chiefs would love a turnout of as much as 70%.
Absolutely, but the local election in March, this is only 4 or 5 months ago, was 89%.
Right.
So there's a significant drop in turnout here. And that would suggest that most people thought the result was a foregone conclusion, which I think everyone around this table and in Istanbul would agree it was. So they said, well, what's the point in me voting? None of the candidates inspire me.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. We're discussing the presidential election in Turkey and what it means for the country that bridges the East and the West. With me in the studio is Dr. Ezra Oyzerek, who's a reader in contemporary Turkish studies at the London School of Economics. Also here in the studio, Dr. Konstantinos Matakos, who is a fellow in political science and political economy at the LSE, and Michael Sercan-Daventry, English editor at the newspaper Londra Gazeta. On the line is Bunyamin Esen, who is a columnist at Turkey's Daily Sabah newspaper. But what are we to take, Konstantinos, about the candidate from the pro-Kurdish People's Democratic Party, Selahattin Demirtas? Did he try to reach out to a broader constituency than just Kurds? Was he kind of the voice of perhaps secularism that maybe Erdogan wasn't? And what does it say about Turkey that such a candidate can even stand?
Yes, that was actually the positive surprise, if you want, for someone who observed Turkish politics, to see that the pro-Kurdish party didn't campaign in Kurdish nationalistic terms. It went above the Kurdish lines. It campaigned, to me, it struck as if it's a social liberal Scandinavian politician who's putting into the agenda issues of rights and freedoms and women's rights and labor rights and how to create a pluralistic society, not particularly campaigning about the time for Kurds to be vindicated or to alleviate their grievances, but this should come as a part of a broader package of making Turkey a more advanced democracy. And his scores, his electoral support in big centers, even in Izmir, I think he'd get 80%, speak to that. Izmir is a stronghold of old school Kemalist tradition. And for a candidate of Kurdish origin to score this number of votes shows that he managed to enter into this electorate that actually could be, in the long run, more scary for Erdogan support. Because last time that the center-left party won elections in Turkey was with Bülent Ecevit in the 70s, because there was this left-right alignment of votes. Now all this poor vote is going single-handedly to Erdogan as a result of the 80s coup d'etat, where the labor unions and the left political activism was shut down, whereas religion is more deeply rooted and was allowed to understream fuse this discontent. So if the Demirtas or this party managed to regain some of these constituencies back from the conservative right, then that would potentially undermine more Erdogan's rule than the CHP, if a non-transformed old-school CHP or the MHP party.
Because he's a young man, isn't he? And he so that would be considered quite a considerable success of this election.
Yes, that was a very promising campaign that he ran, and I think he set the bar very high for his party, and it would be a challenge for him and his party comrades to stand up to that numbers and show that they can actually transform from a Kurdish grievance party into a mainstream political force in Turkey that represents the liberal left, which is something that political representation of this segment in Turkey is really not transparent. Some of those people are expressed through the left vein of the CHP, but there is not a party to represent those people.
The trick with Turkish elections, parliamentary elections, is that there's a 10% electoral threshold. So if you don't get 10% of the vote across the country, then you don't get into parliament, irrespective of how well you do in one particular part. And Kurds in Turkey normally populated about 6 or 7% of the vote. So as a party, they weren't a realistic prospect of getting into parliament. What Demirtas has done is quite remarkable, because he pushed 9 to 9.5%, and that makes entering parliament on his own terms a very realistic prospect. So he's one to watch for the next couple of years.
Do you think other minorities were marginalised during these elections? Perhaps Alevis, non-practicing Muslims, non-believers? I mean, how were they represented, do you think, Michael?
Well, the Prime Minister very notoriously made some divisive comments about Armenians in particular on a live broadcast, where he said, "Excuse me, some people have been referring to me as an Armenian." And the inflection in his tone was to suggest that this was some kind of an insult. Erdogan did not lead any kind of a unifying campaign. He was divisive. He appealed to his own core constituency, the conservative Anatolian Muslim vote, and he attacked Alevis because the main opposition party leader himself has Alevi roots.
Benjamin, Mr. Erdogan has said that he wants to remain in power for the centenary of the modern Turkish Republic. That's maybe 9 years away. I mean, what kind of constitutional changes will he bring in? What kind of powers will he bring in for the presidency?
The answer of this question lies in the meaning of presidency in Turkey. I think there are strict controversies on this issue. Some discuss that presidency is a ceremonial post in Turkey, and in this regard, others discuss that presidency is a key political position for balancing the discussions and in favor of the military guardianship of Kemalist regime. The actual election did a lot in normalizing the country's political regime. Yesterday's elections is the cracking the codes of 1980 military coup d'etat, which designed the constitution, and within the constitution, the presidency as a mandate over civil ruling of the country. So in this sense, I think that yesterday's election has made a significant change in the formulation of politics in Turkey.
Ezra, I mean, how does Mr. Erdogan view Turkey's role, not just in the region, but globally? I mean, he has criticised the West on everything, ranging from Egypt to Syria. I'm wondering, is he keen to project power in the region, and will he use this presidency to do that?
I imagine that is definitely one of his aspirations. And then he has a neo-Ottoman imaginary, that he imagines a Turkey that is powerful throughout the region. By
neo-Ottoman, do you mean he wants to kind of go back? He wants to hark back to the glories of the empire.
Yeah, exactly. You know, I think he imagines that kind of a role for Turkey that has influence in the region, not in terms of course, ruling these regions, but being an important leader in the region.
What about with the European Union? I mean, what about Turkey's role in its aspirations, its European Union aspirations?
It looks like when he first came to power, he really was keen on that. And then, he was taking the steps. But it looks like, he is not that keen on it. Some observers say that alignment with the European Union was important for his fight against military tutelage in Turkey. And once he accomplished that goal, he doesn't think he has that much to gain for being part of the European Union. And of course, the economy went back in the European Union.
Konstantinos, what about the Kurdish question? I'm wondering, Mr. Erdogan's negotiations with the Kurds, how is it impacted by, say, attacks on Kurdish areas by the Islamic State? How is that playing out, and how is that playing out into his kind of long-term view of the Kurdish question?
AKP's policy towards the Kurdish minority can be viewed under multiple spectrums. So it is true that situation for the Kurdish population has improved in the last 10 years, and mainly because of the process of approachment with the European Union and the parts of the Copenhagen criteria which dictated more freedom and ability of minorities to transmit and broadcast television shows and radio in their mother tongue. But I think his attempt to solve the Kurdish problem is being undermined by his own neo-Ottoman and very absurd foreign policy, very, let's say, unprincipled foreign policy. Like, if you observe, and I think this is partly also the blame for Prime Ministerial hopeful Professor Davutoglu's design in foreign policy. So you observe Turkey's been switching alliances, so it's with Egypt, and then it's not with Egypt, and then the Syrian regime is our friend and brother, then the Syrian regime is a dictator and an oppressor, then Israel we do business with in the security domain, then Israel there is a bunch of murderers, then the Iraqi Kurds are our allies, but at the same time we supply weapons to the Syrian rebels, which some of those weapons might have handed in the hands of ISIS. To sum it up, the American ambassador had said it very politically incorrectly for an American, but it was a very accurate description. It is a rover car with an aspiration of a Rolls Royce. So Turkey is a solid rover. It is indeed a regionally important country in the area, one that West really needs to stabilize the area, because if you see there's a mayhem over there. But it's good if Turkey's aspirations are toned down to its real capabilities in the area, and instead of trying to influence the Kurdish politics in the area or what's happening in the Middle East, try to focus to solve its own problem through more democratic openness. So these famous Erdogan's democratization packages, every time they're being announced and every time that they're being delivered, are always curtailed and always trimmed. So it's a package is announced, and then when it comes to the parliament, half of those measures are being implemented, whether it comes to the Armenian, to the Greek, or to the Kurdish minority. So there's always something lost in the way from the promise.
Can I get Benjamin's response to that? The sentiment from the studio really is Mr. Erdogan's foreign policy is a muddled one.
I don't agree with that, because Erdogan has, of course, I understand he has a conservative party and he has conservative aims. You can define it in a neo-Ottoman way. I understand all of these critics. But in the end, what he says, we have to judge him with what he did and what he says, what his ambition means.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Brendan Cole. We're discussing the aftermath of the Turkish presidential elections with Ezra Ozurik, Konstantinos Matsakos, Michael Daventry and Bunyamin Essen. Michael, I'd like to ask you about the key foreign policy priorities for Mr. Erdogan in the short-term future. What do you think?
The immediate issue is what's happening on his doorstep. We're talking, most prominently, I'd say, the fact that there are 40-odd or up to 50 Turkish diplomatic staff still being held hostage in a Turkish consulate in Mosul.
Which he has been blamed for.
He has been blamed for, and he's also ordered a reporting ban in Turkey on it. So this isn't something that's being covered in Turkey because it cannot be covered in Turkey, and infringing reporting bans in Turkey are punishable by very severe fines. And nobody outside Turkey has perhaps the resources to look into it, but they're still there. They've been there for almost 2 months. And for somebody who talks about rebuilding a Middle East which is led by Turkey, it seems very strange that he can't seem to rescue so many of his own diplomatic staff from somewhere so close.
Who could potentially be used as human shields. Let's say the worst happens, and let's hope that it doesn't. If there's reporting restrictions, he won't necessarily feel the brunt of any kind of outcry against that.
Well, exactly. And this is something he's done before. There was, I can't quite remember, I'm afraid. I think it happened late last year, the attack in Reyhanlı, which was a town in Hatay province, very close to the Syrian border. There was a suicide bombing. and 50 people were killed in that. A reporting restriction was placed straight down on that area immediately afterwards. So it wasn't just about, and they said rather it was because we're trying to find the perpetrators of this terrible attack, which you can perhaps understand. But the reporting restriction went on for so many days, and the press couldn't even interview the victims of the tragedy.
But he is a Democrat at heart, though, isn't he, Ezra? I mean, he has a mandate to rule.
I mean, when he first came to power, he really made significant changes in Turkey. You know, he really changed the military tutelage system in Turkey, which is an amazing accomplishment in terms of democracy. He really gave so many rights to Kurds, amazing accomplishments. Things are happening now in Turkey that we couldn't imagine that they would happen in the 1990s. He also has been, even despite that comment on Armenians, before that, he made very promising statements about the Armenian issue. Even though he never mentioned the word Armenian genocide, he made an apology. It wasn't a formal apology, but he's the first Turkish statesman who brought up the issue that bad things really happened to Armenians, and then he is ready to take an apologetic position. So these are really things that could not be imaginable in the 1980s and 1990s. So in these aspects, he really took important steps towards democratizing Turkey. But since 2010, he's increasingly turning towards a more civilian authoritarian approach. Very harsh reactions to protesters, or to anyone who is in opposition towards him. He made some democratic accomplishments, but at the same time, we have seen that he can do very undemocratic steps as well.
Konstantinos, if he does stay in power until 2023, which would be the centenary of the founding of the modern Turkish state, how do you see it playing out domestically? I mean, I guess we talked about the positive moves with the other candidates and the Kurdish candidate, Mr. Demirtas, and perhaps would he be trying to get more support and maybe broadening the secular base of the electorates, and maybe Mr. Erdogan won't last until that long?
Well, certainly Erdogan's view of democratic and elective politics is a majoritarian one. So I think what we're going to observe in this, certainly the electoral result was not surprising, but the political system that I expect that we will see in Turkey will be a new one. So Erdogan is going to push towards his majoritarian understanding of democracy, and the presidential system, which I personally find it doesn't suit a pluralistic society with so many minorities like Turkey. But anyways, I think he will push toward that, and snap elections are an option to get a supermajority in the parliament. And there is Demirtas's and the point that was raised earlier, a very good point, that if the Kurdish party may transform itself to a mainstream party that passes the electoral threshold, that could be the blocking coalition of Erdogan's constitutional change, in which case he has to bring it back to the people and has to fight another electoral race to pass a reform through a referendum, in which case success might not be so assured. But certainly he will try to push towards an executive presidential system a la Turca, not the American with check and balances, but with a little bit less checks and balances in the mixture. And that obviously will aggravate the opposition. If you see the voting blocks, the result of 2014 is a copy-paste of the 2011 result. Erdogan gets 21 million votes, the Nationalist Party get about 5 million votes, and the secular opposition CHP get 11 million votes, and that's basically it. And the small left parties went for Demirtas this time instead of coalescing with the CHP. So that's the society. It's a 52-48, 53, it doesn't matter, 51-49 split, where there is a 52% who really adores Erdogan and his way of governing and is their man, as they say, and there is another equally large segment of society who opposes clearly all of his policies. And that would be a very combustive mixture. And it would be, I hope Turkey escapes this stream of polarization, but I see a more polarizing path. Partially because I think what the West initially translated as democratization efforts or a democratization process in Turkey, which actually tricked many of us, including myself, was probably a power grab from one elite into another. So when the old elite was fading and the new elite was emerging, there was a point of equality in terms of relative strengths, which was perceived by outsiders as more democracy in Turkey, more fair game, more competition. Once the old elite was completely subsumed and marginalized, and the new elite or the new status quo emerged.
And actually, Michael, just finally, I suppose what the West wants is a thriving democratic, secular Turkey in a region where all those qualities are manifestly absent. Can we have confidence that that will happen?
I'm not sure we can have confidence. We can carry on watching and seeing. The cliche is to say there's a battle for Turkey's soul. I think there's been a battle for Turkey's soul for centuries. It's just they've always been talking about this country which is at the network between Europe, Asia and the Middle East, and how it influences all the countries around them. What we're seeing in Turkey at the moment is, after a good 50, 60 years of Turkey facing Europe, you've got a group of people who've developed a strategy for using their ideology based on Islam to try and influence countries in the East instead. That's succeeded today, as you can see with Erdogan's victory. The real thing that the West will have to be watching is Erdogan's interpretation of democracy. He says he's got a mandate. His idea is 52% have voted for me, therefore I can do what I like. But that does mean ignoring the 48%.
And he did make the point that he was governing for all Turks. Quite a conciliatory tone, I thought, in his acceptance speech, or at least his victory speech, but we'll definitely a lot to look out for. Many thanks. That's Michael Sercan-Daventry, English editor at Londra Gazeta, speaking there. Also here in the studio, Dr. Konstantinos Matakos, who's a fellow in political science and political economy at the London School of Economics, and Ezra Ozurik, who's the chair for contemporary Turkish studies at the LSE. Also on the line, Benjamin Essen, who's a columnist at Turkey's Daily Sabah newspaper. Many thanks for joining me, Brendan Cole, at the Voice of Russia in London. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. Recep Tayyip Erdogan has secured a historic win in Turkey's first presidential elections, cementing his role as the nation's leader for the next 5 years. With almost all the votes counted, Mr. Erdogan led with 52%. This was 13 points ahead of his main opponent, Ekmelettin Ihsanoglu, a Turkish diplomat with a low domestic profile. The election marks the first stage of an ambitious plan by Mr. Erdogan to transform Turkey's government into one led by presidential politics, with himself as leader. He wants to secure more power for the presidency, but his opponents do fear increasingly authoritarian rule. Until now, the presidency has been largely ceremonial, but this is set to change. So what do these elections signify for the future of Turkey? Well, to discuss this and the issues surrounding it, I'm pleased to be joined in the studio by Dr.
The succession race. I think the main point is that Erdogan's policies has the power to touch the daily lives of people on the ground, especially the welfare policies. The voters, the ordinary voters' voting preferences are pretty sensitive to welfare policies, and Erdogan is very, very ambitious and has made several reforms in that area. Especially middle and low-income voting groups are voting in favor of Erdogan because they are feeling the improvements in their daily lives. I want to refer somebody, Adil Gür, ANG polling company from Turkey, and also Bekir Ağırdır, Konda polling company. They are saying that especially housewives and low-income groups are going to the ballot and voting for Erdogan because they are
accusations that broke in the 17th of December. That wasn't a major concern, but a good economy was a concern. So I think that really played a role.
And those bribery allegations, Michael, that she's referring to there, that was a probe launched in December. It threw up allegations of graft, kickbacks, money laundering. Mr. Erdogan, of course, denied any kind of wrongdoing, but it seemed to make more of an international splash than it did a domestic one. Would that be fair to say, do you think?
I think, yeah, that is fair to say. There seems to have been a moment round about, let's say, 2010, 2011, or shortly after he won the election in 2011, when certainly the international media stopped looking at Erdogan as the sort of darling of Muslim democracy, a sort of model that can be pushed out to other countries in the region, and started looking at him more as a bit more of an autocrat, a bit more of a man who likes to impose his will and not listen to the other side. And I think the incident that you refer to is definitely the latest in the line of that. It didn't have the impact in the country.
Ezra Ozurik, who's the chair for contemporary Turkish studies at the London School of Economics, also here in the studio. Michael Sercan-Daventry, who's the English editor at the Londra Gazeta, That's the voice of London's Turkish, Kurdish and Turkish Cypriot communities. Also here is Dr. Konstantinos Matakos, who's a fellow in political science and political economy at the LSE. And on the line, Benjamin Essen, who's a social security inspector at the Social Security Institution of Turkey. He's also a columnist at Turkey's daily Sabah newspaper. Benjamin, I'll start with you. First of all, I mean, each time Turkish citizens have gone to the ballot box since 2002, the AKP has been victorious. So I guess Mr. Erdogan must be doing something right.
Yeah, that's right. A good point. This is the 9th election victory of President-elect of Recep Tayyip Erdogan. And this is very important, I think, because in the recent history of the Europe, we couldn't see any political leader who can really pretty sensitive for the services, the improvements in the services. In this sense, Adil Gür emphasized that housewives are the best on acting accordingly to the realpolitik. They can feel the improvements in healthcare services, for example, family practitioners, and decrease in medicine prices. The main achievement of Erdogan is his social policy.
And I guess one of the other achievements, Ezra, is that the considerable eye-watering growth, economic growth in Turkey, something like 9% back in 2010, while the rest of Europe were hammered by an economic crisis. Are people voting with their pockets?
Many observers share this point that the good economy has been a major concern for the voters. For example, studies show that most of the voters, for example, didn't care that much about the bribery